So CD Projekt Red showed this at Unreal Fest last year. Over 300 NPCs in a marketplace running at 60 frames per second on a base PS5. CD bumps a vendor, the apples spill, a kid runs for one, a pig chases another. What CDPR called an unscripted chain reaction. The conversation since has been pretty much what you'd expect. Some confusing this tech demo for real gameplay, others skeptical of the visuals, plenty skeptical of Unreal itself. But the thread I got stuck on was different. People were calling back to the Cyberpunk E3 gameplay demo from 2018. They've heard these NPC promises before. So, what's different this time? To answer that, you need to know what was hard to begin with. Because 300 fully animated characters in one scene is the number studios have been working around for a decade. Every open world game that has tried has hit a wall somewhere, a wall that isn't rendering AI or physics. The pitch of this tech demo: CDPR and Epic build tools that move it. The architecture behind the demo is public, the tools ship with Unreal, which matters. The demo itself we can't verify, that's CDPR seen on CDPR's hardware, and we won't see the full thing until the game releases. But the architecture underneath is in Unreal today, so we can do something better than just take their word for it. We can test whether the tools do what they claim to do. Before we open Unreal, it's worth understanding what we've been working around all this time. Because the problem isn't new. You've watched games try to solve this for years. When people talk about NPCs that feel real, they're usually talking about Red Dead 2. NPCs remember you, they react to the weather, they have opinions about your host. Bump someone in St. Denis and it cascades. A person shouts, a witness reacts, the law gets involved. But count the people on screen. In St. Denis, the busiest place in the game, you're looking at maybe 50 or 60 at a single time. Rockstar made each character so deep, so expensive to animate and simulate that the engine simply can't afford more of them. It doesn't hurt the game, it's exactly what the setting wants, but the trade off is still there. Every open world studio has found a different place to put that trade off. Hitman Absolution put 1,000 people in a level in 2012, but most of them are shells, empty bodies looping an animation with AI brains that only get swapped in when gameplay needs them. Assassin's Creed Unity filled the streets of Paris 2 years later, but anything past 40 meters is running on 11 bones, and full skeletons are capped at around 40 characters. From a rooftop, it looks incredible. At street level, most of them are puppets. Cyberpunk tried to hold the look without faking the crowds. Every district has its own visual language, every NPC dressed to match, but follow anyone for a few seconds and you see the gap. They walk their loop, maybe sit at a bench, then vanish when you turn around. They don't remember you, they don't react unless you point a gun at them, and even then they forget. The art direction is extraordinary, but the behavior underneath is still shallow. KCD2 might be the most recent ambitious shot anyone's taken at doing both. Warhorse Studios put 1,500 NPCs in Gutenberg, everyone on a daily schedule. And the behavior underneath is genuinely reactive. NPCs comment if Henry's dirty, drunk, naked. They react to your host. They remember you. But ride into the city and you notice something. You can't gallop. The game physically slows you down because the engine needs time to load and animate the NPCs around you. And if you move too fast, you can't keep up. 5 studios, 5 different places to put that cost. Some went big and faked the characters. Some kept the numbers small and went deep. Some reached for both and felt the seams. When CDPR showed 300 characters in a marketplace, all doing their own thing at 60 FPS, they were claiming to break through something that shaped every one of these games. So, what was it? Animation. Let me explain. If you want your game to run at 60 frames per second, you have about 16.7 milliseconds to do everything. So that's your gameplay, AI, physics, graphics, audio, UI, animation. All of it has to fit inside that window. Miss that window and you feel it. That's the classic stutter, the hitch when frame time spikes. And most of those systems have been getting more efficient over the years. Rendering went massively parallel. That's what Nanite is. Millions of triangles processed without the CPU managing each one of them. Physics moved off to worker threads. Particle systems got completely rebuilt. But animation, specifically, Animating lots of characters at once is where the game thread still gets hammered. And it's not because nobody tried, it's because animation has a problem the others don't. Rendering doesn't care what quest you're on, physics doesn't check whether your character is injured, but animation is tangled up with everything. What the AI just decided, what the player just pressed, what state the game is in. That entanglement is what makes it so hard to split across scores the same way rendering and physics did. And this isn't theoretical. In a talk from 2024, a CDPR core engineer put it bluntly: animated characters are the heaviest thing you can put in a scene. On every title hit shipped, that was what limited their vision. Every open world studio hits this wall. And Unreal has been chipping away at this for years. A lot of the low level pipeline can already parallelize, but the way developers actually build animation system still tends to pull work back onto that single main thread. And when you've got 500 characters, that's 500 visits the game thread every frame. And that's the part that gets expensive at scale. So let's see what that actually looks like. I've got Unreal 5.6 and I'm going to start simple. 500 characters in a bare scene with 3 animation states with transitions on Unreal's default animation system, Animation Blueprint. There is no AI, physics, or gameplay. I just want to isolate the animation system and see what happens. We're getting about 88 frames per second. Let's look at where that time is actually going. This is UWorld Tech, where your entire simulation runs every frame. Gameplay, logic, AI, physics, animation, all of it. In a normal game, this would be split across a dozen systems. But this scene has none of that. It's just 500 characters playing animations. So almost everything under the world tech here is animation work. And look at how it's structured. 500 tiny slivers, one for each character. The game thread touches every character's animation instance, orchestrating hundreds of tiny per character operations every frame. That orchestration is what you're seeing as those 500 slivers. And sum all those slivers up together and you get 4.8 milliseconds. That's almost 42% of the frame just to manage this dispatch. But this is 500 mannequins in an empty scene. No one ships a game that looks like this. This is Epic's City sample, the full Matrix Awakens environment. If you played the demo back in 2021, this is what was running under the hood. Night geometry everywhere, lumen global illumination, a full procedural city with traffic systems, pedestrian AI, and a crowd of meta-human characters walking the streets. The crowd behaviors, where NPCs go, what they do, runs on a system called Mass. The animations on those characters run on animation blueprints. And every character has a lot going on. There's 2 separate animation pipelines per character, one for the body and one for the head. And there's also accessories, facial rig evaluation, look at behaviors, blend spaces. These are expensive characters. If the synthetic test hit 42% on bare mannequins, it should be catastrophic here, right? Let's find out. Let's see, at max crowd density, we're getting about 68 frames per second. That's a 14.6 millisecond frame. Summing the animation timers, we get about 1.24 milliseconds. That's roughly 8.5% of the frame, which actually sounds fine until you look at what you're actually counting. The scene doesn't look empty, there are characters everywhere, but most of what you're seeing here is exactly the tricks we talked about earlier. Simplified skeletons, reduced bone counts, characters running cheaper evaluation at distance. At default settings, the number of metahumans running at full animation fidelity is about 16. In the scene Epic built to showcase what Unreal 5 can do with crowds, 16 characters get the real animation pipeline. So what happens when we push past that? City sample exposes load controls for the crowd. I can tell the engine, keep more characters at full fidelity instead of culling them. And the shape is exactly what you'd expect from the mannequin test. More characters at full fidelity means more slivers on the game thread, more per character dispatches, more serial work that can't overlap. So instead of walking through 4 profiler captures, let's just plot the numbers on a graph. So we start at 16 characters, and time spent by animation on the game thread is 1.24 milliseconds. Push it to about 39 characters, 2.68. 112 becomes 5.78. 223, and we're at 10.45. It's linear. Every metahuman you add costs the same as the last one. There's no economy of scale because the architecture doesn't allow it. The same structural problem from the mannequin test, just wearing more expensive clothes. And in frame times, it's 68 FPS at baseline, then 42, then 27, and finally at 13. Now, hold on. 13 FPS is a 76 millisecond frame. And we said animation is 10 milliseconds of that, which means animation is 13% of the frame. Not exactly the thing breaking the scene, except that's only what the profiler can label directly as animation work. Animation doesn't just stay in its lane. It blocks game thread work, thrashes the cache, stalls ticks that are waiting on it. That pressure is real, but it's smeared across timers that don't say animation on them. So the 10 milliseconds is the absolute floor, not the ceiling. And the simplest way to prove it is to just turn animation off and see what happens. So I did. Same scene at max density, everything running except the animation system. The frame time dropped by 40%. At this crowd density, animation is by far the single largest cost in the scene, and it's not close. That's the wall. So here's the thing about that curve. It's not a performance bug. You can't shader optimize your way out of it, can't throw it on a faster GPU. The game thread has to touch every character, every frame in sequence. It's just the way it works. And it's worth understanding why it's built that way, because it wasn't a mistake. Animation blueprints are 11 years old. When Epic designed them, a typical multiplayer match had around 10 players, and consumer hardware was shipping 2 to 6 cores. The system was built for that world, and it scaled well. Today, Fortnite runs 100 players in a PR match across everything from the Switch to high end consoles, all on animation blueprints. And that's a genuine success story. But the ambition has moved past what the system was designed for. 100 capsule driven players in a big arena is a different problem than 300 fully animated NPCs in a tight, open world marketplace, each one running a heavy animation pipeline. The architecture served its era, but the era has changed. So CDPR's bet was rebuild the architecture. There's an experimental plugin shipping with Unreal 5.6 called the Unreal Animation Framework. It's a ground up rebuild of how animation evaluation works. CDPR started building towards this at least a year before the Witcher 4 demo. In August 2024, they showed 1,600 animated characters running on 4 worker threads, with the game thread basically empty. They built it in partnership with Epic, and the core architecture made its way upstream into the engine before the Witcher 4 tech demo. The idea is simple to state and architecturally radical. Animation evaluation moves off the game thread. Instead of the game thread stepping through every character one by one, animation work gets batched and distributed across worker threads. The main thread is left with just scheduling and cleanup. Let's see if it actually works. Here's the same scene with 500 mannequins, this time running with UAF. Only the pipeline has changed. 87 frames per second became 104. That's decent, but that's not the number we're interested in. Look at GT animation. It's 0. It's not mostly clear, it's 0 milliseconds. The profiler can't find it. Those 500 slivers, the 4.8 millisecond tax on the game thread, the 42% of the frame we were looking at a few minutes ago are not reduced. They're structurally gone. But placeholder mannequins in an empty box is one thing. What happens in the real scene? Here's the same crowd, same characters, and the same everything. Only the animation pipeline has changed. I ported both the crowd and the vehicles to run on the new pipeline. And I should say that was not trivial. UAF is still experimental, the documentation is sparse, and this was a complete rebuild of crowd animations. But the point of doing it is that this is the same scene with the same workload. If the numbers move, the architecture is why. Let's look at the stats. Frame time 13.4 milliseconds, 75 frames per second, up from 68. GT animation is zero point 0.44 milliseconds, down from 1.24. That's 1 point on the new line, about 25 metahumans at default density. But the default case isn't where this matters. What happens when we push the LOD the same way we did with animation blueprints? At about 46 characters, UF holds at 0.48. 131 characters, 0.84. 263 characters, we're at 1.35. The UAF line barely moves. From 25 to 263 characters, a tenfold increase in crowd density, and GT animation costs didn't even triple. Under animation blueprints, every extra metahuman costs the same as the last. Under UAF, the per character cost in the game thread drops as density goes up. The curve bends. Now, let's look at that graph one more time. Animation Blueprint's game thread spent 1.24 milliseconds on animation with 16 characters. UAF's game thread spent 1.35 milliseconds with 263. With the same budget on the game thread, UAF handled 16 times the number of characters. And before we pull back, one more check. Remember the control test from earlier, the no animation test. That number doesn't change between animation blueprints and UAF. Animation is off either way. So what changes is how far each pipeline sits above that floor at max density. Animation blueprints at 40% above that floor. UAF sits 13% above it. It's the same story as before. The labeled GT animation number is what you'd measure in practice, and by that measure, UF's costs barely moved. The gap to the no animation flow tells you the hidden ripple collapsed too. UF isn't just cheaper in its own lane, it's polluting the rest of the frameless. Now, UAF at max density is still only running at 18 frames per second on my machine. That's not a shipping frame rate. UAF didn't make the scene magically fast. What it did was move the bottleneck. Animation used to be the thing capping the scene. Now it's one cost among several others. Rendering, Baltic work, mask out simulation, all the 2021 systems City Sample is still running under the hood. So if animation isn't the bottleneck anymore, what does that actually change? So let's come back to this. City bumps a man carrying a crate. He stumbles, drops the apples, and they roll downhill. A kid runs over. Pigs chase another. CDPR's name for this, unscripted chain reaction. CDPR's engineering director framed it as a thesis of the whole demo. Interactivity not just between the player and the world, but between elements in the world. We couldn't see what that meant at the start of the video. But now we can, because look at what it actually requires. It requires the man with the crate, the kid, the pigs, the people to turn their heads. Every single character in that chain has to be available to participate at that moment the event happens. They can't be a puppet or a reduced skeleton shell. They have to be fully animated, running their own behavior, ticking on the same frame. And let's go back to the curve we plotted. Under the old architecture, you'd run out of animation budget around 16 characters at full fidelity. The kid in the apple crate chain, if he's 20 meters away, isn't animating at full fidelity. He's on a cheap LOD, or he's one of those empty shells from earlier games we talked about. He physically cannot notice the apple and run for it with real animation because the budget ran out 12 characters ago. The chain reaction doesn't happen, or if it happens, but it's been scripted and placed by a designer for that one street corner and nowhere else in the city. And a couple of systems are collaborating that makes all of this possible. UAF is animating every character in the chain. Mass, the behavior layer we saw earlier, is what tells the kid to notice the apple and the pig to decide it's hungry. Mass isn't new. City Sample was running it back in 2021. What's new is that UAF made the animation cheap enough that Mass has room to actually drive 300 character decisions instead of a couple dozen. CDPR have a line they've been using about the demo. Their goal, they said, was to make the gap between City and the NPCs as small as possible. Read that back against what we talked about in previous games earlier in the video. That gap between the protagonist, who is fully simulated, and the crowd, who mostly isn't, is exactly what every one of those games shipped around. Each studio hit the same wall and paid for it somewhere. That wall is what just moved. Now, a few things I want to be clear about. UAF is still marked experimental. The documentation is thin. Porting City Sample was not a trivial project. At max density, the scene on my machine was still running at 18 frames per second. UAF alone didn't make it particularly fast. It moved the bottleneck. The curve bent. It didn't disappear. And The Witcher 4 is possibly years from shipping. There's a long distance between the architecture works in a benchmark and the ships in a game that players love. But remember, these benchmarks from this video are from 5.6, the first version to ship UAF publicly. For any studio picking it up today, 5.7's been out for months and 5.8 is just around the corner. The floor keeps going up. And here's the thing, UAF is just animation. The Witcher 4 demo was also running Night Foliage, MLD Farmer, Fastio, a whole separate stack I'll get into in a future video. But if this demo had shipped on a proprietary engine, we'd be just taking CDPR's word for it. The reason I could open a profiler and actually test the claims is that all of this ships with Unreal. CDPR and Epic built it together and pushed it upstream. It's not a competitive mode. It's a plugin any dev can download. For 20 years, every open world game has shipped with some version of a crowd density slide. Every player knows what happens when you crank it. The frame rate drops because every extra character costs the same as the last one. That equation just changed. The question used to be, deep characters or dense crowds, pick one. That question isn't gone, but the cost of choosing both just dropped, and the curve bends the right way now.